It begins in silence. A sterile reading room at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Fluorescent lights hum softly overhead. The air smells faintly of dust and aging paper. It is January 2025. A researcher, gloved hands steady, opens a long-sealed brown archival box stamped Declassified. Inside, yellowed memos and faded carbon copies spill a story that the world thought it already knew. Operation Paperclip. Hitler's scientists now seen again through documents once locked away for generations. On each page, names appear beside new annotations, revisions, and signatures once blacked out by heavy ink. Notes from intelligence officers. Clearance forms stamped urgent. Memos between military engineers and bureaucrats whose handwriting helped redraw the post-war world. For decades, these papers were ghosts in the margins of American history. Now, for the first time, they are breathing again, revealing how and why some of the Third Reich's most brilliant and most compromised minds were not tried in courtrooms, but welcomed into laboratories across the United States. The boxes sit quietly, but their weight is immeasurable. They hold the blueprint of a moral paradox, one born in the ashes of 1945 and unsealed in the year 2025. Europe in 1945 was a landscape of ruins. Cities once pulsing with life lay flattened beneath twisted steel and scorched stone. Germany, the core of the fallen Reich, was divided among victors, each carving out zones of control, each searching not only for territory, but for knowledge. As the smoke of the Second World War thinned, the Allied powers understood one sobering truth. Hitler's Germany had advanced science faster than almost any nation on Earth. Jet propulsion, guided missiles, chemical and medical research, all had leapt forward under the Reich's relentless, often brutal pressure. The world's most destructive war had also been its most rapid laboratory. When American troops entered Nordhausen and the Harz Mountains, they found the underground complex of Mittelwerk, a cavernous network of tunnels built by slave labor where the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, had been assembled. The facility still smelled of oil, damp stone, and death. Nearby, at Dora concentration camp, the cost of those technological triumphs was plain. Thousands of prisoners had died in darkness to bring the rocket to life. Yet amid the horror, U.S. intelligence officers also saw opportunity. The men who built these weapons, the engineers, metallurgists, and physicists, were now scattered, captured, or in hiding. To Washington, they represented not only Germany's scientific elite, but a potential arsenal against the Soviet Union. The first step was small, improvised, and cloaked in urgency. Under the codename Operation Overcast, American military intelligence began collecting German scientists for questioning. The program was pragmatic, born out of fear that the Soviets would seize the same talent. The U.S. Army's Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, soon took control, compiling lists of specialists in rocketry, aerodynamics, medicine, and chemical warfare. Names like Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and Hubertus Strughold surfaced repeatedly. Men who had designed the Reich's rockets and medicine, now marked as assets. In the chaos of post-war Europe, recruitment often blurred with abduction. Teams of American officers swept through occupied zones, offering deals or simply ordering transport. By September 1945, the first group of scientists had arrived on American soil under temporary military contracts. They were taken to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, where they began reconstructing V-2 rockets for U.S. Army testing. Photographs from the time show German engineers in American uniforms, smiling stiffly beside missile fragments bearing swastika markings hastily painted over with U.S. insignia. It was the beginning of a moral gray zone, one that would expand for decades. Inside Washington, the idea of employing former Nazi scientists was far from universally accepted. The State Department and Justice Department raised strong objections, arguing that individuals involved with the Nazi Party or slave labor should be excluded. The War Department, however, viewed the matter through a colder lens, the onset of the Cold War. Intelligence suggested that the Soviet Union had already begun its own recruitment drives, later known as Operation Paperclip, seizing entire laboratories and deporting German specialists eastward. In the new global order, ideology was rapidly giving way to strategy. By late 1946, Overcast had been quietly renamed Operation Paperclip, a reference to the paperclips attached to personnel files marked for expedited clearance. Many of those files contained evidence of Nazi affiliation, but the JIOA's solution was administrative rather than moral. Background reports were rewritten, political histories softened, and security assessments adjusted to ensure that key scientists could be legally brought into the United States. President Harry S. Truman had publicly forbidden the hiring of any individual who was a member of the Nazi Party or more than a nominal participant in its activities. Yet the bureaucratic machinery beneath him moved differently. By altering dossiers and minimizing ideological ties, military officials made certain that the president's directive remained, in practice, a technicality. In November 1946, the first official paperclip contingent arrived at Wright Field in Ohio. There, they began contributing to U.S. aviation and weapons development programs. The scientists lived in isolated military housing, monitored but not confined, their movements restricted but their expertise in high demand. Slowly, a network of German specialists began embedding into the American defense infrastructure. Mathematicians at Wright Field, medical experts at Randolph Air Force Base, chemists at Camp Detrick. The line between captive and collaborator blurred with each passing month. Meanwhile, in Europe, the files grew. For every scientist transferred, reports were generated, coded, and stored. Memoranda detailing clearances, psychological evaluations, and denazification certificates. These were the very papers that would lie dormant for decades, locked in archives and filing cabinets, their full contents unseen. Only in fragments would the public hear of them. Whispers of secrecy, questions from journalists, denials from officials. But within those pages, now unsealed in 2025, was the story of how a nation decided that victory in the Cold War required the selective forgetting of the last one. It was a story still unfolding, even as rockets began to pierce the skies over New Mexico, and it was only the beginning. By 1947, the operation that began as a desperate scramble for intelligence had evolved into a structured, state-sanctioned program. Operation Paperclip was no longer an improvised measure, it was policy. The United States, now entering its first full decade of Cold War rivalry, saw in these men the tools to ensure technological dominance. The fragile post-war peace was already dissolving into suspicion between former allies. The Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, and the Soviets' grip on Eastern Europe was tightening. American officials knew that whoever mastered rocketry, nuclear power, and aeronautics would control the next century. The scientists, now numbering in the hundreds, were quietly absorbed into military and industrial projects across the country. Many were resettled under new identities, with their Nazi pasts erased from official documents. Some were placed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, others at Fort Bliss, and a growing number found themselves in the isolated desert of New Mexico. There, at White Sands Proving Ground, they rebuilt and launched modified V-2 rockets under American command. Each successful launch was a triumph, not only of engineering but of secrecy. These missiles, the same design that once terrorized London, now rose under the stars of a new flag. The program's reach widened quickly. By 1949, paperclip scientists had spread beyond missile work. Aeronautical engineers were advising NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, precursor to NASA, while medical researchers were contributing to the Air Force's studies on human survival at high altitudes. Others worked in the shadows of Camp Detrick, exploring biological and chemical defense research. Their expertise, sharpened in the crucible of war, was being repurposed for a different empire's ambitions. America was building not only rockets, but an entire scientific infrastructure on the foundation of its former enemy. The secrecy surrounding Paperclip deepened with each success. Officially, many of the scientists were described as technical specialists from Europe. In press briefings and internal reports, Their identities were diluted under bureaucratic phrasing. The files marked confidential began to pile up in military archives. Letters between officers discussing visas, memos outlining rehabilitation programs, and coded clearances approved by intelligence officials. Declassified material now reveals how many of these scientists were granted citizenship through quiet legal maneuvers, sometimes under false biographical data. The Immigration and Naturalization Service cooperated, often unknowingly, while the JIOA's internal memos instructed clerks to adjust records to maintain plausible deniability. As Cold War urgency grew, so did tolerance for ethical compromise. By 1950, the Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb. The shock was immediate. In Washington, fear replaced hesitation. Any lingering debate about the morality of employing Nazi scientists was buried beneath the need for supremacy. The arms race had begun in earnest, and Paperclip's engineers became indispensable. At Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, Werner von Braun and his team began developing the Redstone missile, the first in a line that would evolve into the Jupiter and ultimately the Saturn V rockets that carried astronauts to the moon. In laboratories and testing ranges, the fingerprints of former Reich scientists were now embedded in the DNA of American progress. The integration was not without resistance. Journalists and congressional staff occasionally stumbled upon traces of the operation. Letters of concern were filed by the State Department's Samuel Klaus and other officials who feared the diplomatic repercussions if the truth became public. Yet each time controversy surfaced, it was quietly contained. Internal reviews concluded that the strategic value of these scientists outweighed the political cost of exposure. Files were sealed, inquiries redirected, and the official narrative reinforced. These were no longer Germans, but American engineers. By the mid-1950s, many of these men were living comfortable lives in American suburbs. Their children attended local schools. Their names appeared in technical journals and conference rosters. A few even received awards from the U.S. government for their contributions to aerospace development. The ghosts of Dora, Peenemünde, and Auschwitz seemed buried beneath layers of new identity and achievement. Yet the documents, those memoranda, clearance forms, and intelligence reports, now opened in 2025, reveal that officials at the time were fully aware of the moral trade being made. The records show debates, handwritten notes of discomfort, and internal warnings ignored in the rush to outpace Moscow. By 1959, the transition was complete. Operation Paperclip had dissolved as a formal program, its functions absorbed into the military-industrial complex that defined mid-century America. Many of its recruits had secured citizenship and permanent positions. The program that began in secrecy had become invisible by normalization. The rockets that once bore Nazi insignia now carried the emblems of the United States Army and soon, NASA. In the public imagination, the story of American scientific triumph was clean, patriotic, and forward-looking. The compromises that made it possible were locked away, literally, behind archive seals marked classified. But history never stays buried forever. Decades later, those same boxes, once hidden in storage basements and intelligence repositories, would be opened again, one by one. Inside, the past waited patiently, ink fading but truth intact. The 2025 declassification would finally allow historians to read the unfiltered record of those years, exposing the quiet decisions that turned former enemies into architects of American power. And within those files lay not only the facts of assimilation, but the moral angles of a nation learning to justify the unthinkable. The story of Hitler's scientists in America is not just about documents and rockets. It is a human story, made of fear, ambition, guilt, and reinvention. When the first German scientists stepped onto American soil, they arrived as both captives and partners. Their faces were gaunt from the collapse of their world, their futures uncertain. Many were men who had worked under the Nazi regime not only out of patriotism, but out of survival, opportunism, or conviction. In interviews and personal letters now visible in the 2025 archives, some wrote of gratitude toward the Americans who saved them from Soviet hands, while others displayed cold pragmatism, seeing in the United States a new patron. not a moral refuge. The moral distance between their past and their new life was measured not in miles, but in silence. For men like Werner von Braun, that silence became a professional shield. Once a proud member of the SS, von Braun now presented himself as an apolitical engineer, focused only on the pursuit of spaceflight. His charm and brilliance made him indispensable. American officers who worked with him described him as visionary and cooperative, a man who could make complex engineering sound like poetry. But the declassified memos reveal something deeper. Letters from intelligence officers noting that von Braun's record at Mittelwerk, where thousands died under forced labor, was to be minimized to ensure his continued employment. Such calculated erasure was not rare. It was systemic. The human angle of Paperclip is one of reinvention through bureaucratic cleansing, a quiet transformation from war criminal to national asset. For the families of these scientists, America offered more than safety. It offered normalcy. Children played in suburban streets while their fathers reported to military bases. German engineers hosted barbecues for American colleagues, attended church services, and bought homes with white picket fences. The contrast was surreal. In a span of just a few years, men once under SS command were designing missiles for the U.S. Army. And yet, inside many of them, the war had never truly ended. Diaries and debrief transcripts show lingering loyalty to old ideals, guilt over the dead, or complete denial of responsibility. The human story of Paperclip was not redemption, it was displacement. They had escaped judgment but not their own shadows. From the human, we turn to the tactical. Paperclip was born not from ideology but necessity. In the chaotic aftermath of 1945, the United States was already preparing for its next opponent, the Soviet Union. The documents reveal the fear that drove everything. The possibility that the Soviets might gain an irreversible advantage in rocketry and nuclear technology. A captured intelligence summary from 1946, unsealed in the 2025 collection, described the situation bluntly. He who controls long-range missile development will control the next war. For American strategists, the decision was grim but logical. To counter Stalin, they needed the same minds that had once served Hitler. The Cold War's first battle was not fought in Berlin or Moscow, but in the laboratories of Huntsville and White Sands. The tactical benefit was immediate. The German engineers provided not only blueprints but experience, years of practical testing the Americans lacked. They taught U.S. soldiers how to assemble V-2 rockets, how to calculate trajectories, and how to design guidance systems capable of hitting distant targets. The declassified memos show that within months of their arrival, missile testing success rates increased dramatically. One 1947 progress report notes, "A significant rise in technical efficiency directly correlated to German input. In the calculus of war, that alone justified every ethical compromise." For the Pentagon, Paperclip had become a strategic weapon, a weapon made of human intellect, not steel. The technological angle is perhaps the most visible legacy. What began in the bunkers of Peenemünde became the foundation of America's ascent to space. The same men who built weapons for Hitler now stood at the dawn of the space age. Under U.S. supervision, they refined rocket fuel mixtures, tested supersonic flight models, and developed gyroscopic guidance systems that would later propel American missiles and spacecraft. The 2025 declassified material includes internal correspondence between the Army and NACA highlighting how German contributions significantly advanced altitude and thrust data collection. In simpler terms, without Paperclip, the United States might not have reached orbit when it did. Yet technology carries memory. Many of the innovations credited to these scientists had been first tested in the most inhumane conditions imaginable. Prisoners from Dora Mittelbau had died assembling the prototypes whose design principles now guided American research. The irony is haunting. The knowledge born from suffering was fueling humanity's greatest technological leap. The 2025 documents include one remarkable annotation from a 1952 ethics review draft, never published, where an Air Force officer wrote in the margin, "We can never know how much of our progress is built on the dead." That line, buried for decades, encapsulates the uneasy marriage between brilliance and brutality that defined the paperclip legacy. Through human reinvention, tactical necessity, and technological gain, Operation Paperclip reshaped not only the American arsenal, but its moral landscape. The new revelations from 2025 make clear that this was not a story of ignorance or accident. It was a deliberate calculus, one the government understood and accepted. And yet the story does not end there. For behind the human faces and engineering triumphs lay a deeper structure, a machine of secrecy, legal manipulation, and moral compromise that kept the truth hidden for generations. The legal foundation of Operation Paperclip was not built in open debate or public law. It was constructed in the shadows of bureaucracy. The declassified files from 2025 expose the machinery that made it possible, revealing how intelligence officers, lawyers, and clerks crafted a legal fiction sturdy enough to survive scrutiny. When President Truman authorized the importation of selected German specialists in 1946, he did so under the condition that no active supporters of Nazism would be admitted. But the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the JIOA, found a way around it. In their internal correspondence, stamped secret and now unsealed, officers discussed how to sanitize personnel records. A name connected to the SS would be reevaluated. A membership card in the Nazi Party would be labeled nominal. A file marked undesirable could be paperclipped to a new page marked cleared. Through language alone, the law was bent until it broke. These manipulations were systematic. The 2025 documents include memos detailing how biographical summaries were rewritten to present candidates in the most favorable light. Some of these revisions were shockingly blunt. A 1947 memorandum from the JIOA's chief legal advisor suggests that negative political material should not accompany scientific evaluation. Another, dated 1948, reads simply, "All references to concentration camp labor to be omitted from final draft." By separating morality from merit, the U.S. military created a two-tiered truth, one for the files and another for history. The paper trail of deception would remain hidden in government vaults for decades, only now surfacing to show how legality was engineered not to uphold justice, but to disguise expedience. At the same time, on the other side of Europe, the Soviet Union was enacting its own mirror operation, Operation Paperclip. In October 1946, Soviet forces rounded up more than 2,000 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, transporting them and their families deep into the USSR. Entire research facilities were dismantled overnight. What the Americans negotiated, the Soviets seized. This competition created a race not just for knowledge, but for people. Each German physicist, each aeronautical designer, was a potential weapon in an ideological war that had barely begun. The 2025 declassified intelligence cables include intercepted communications between U.S. and British operatives discussing Soviet transfers. Moscow acting without restraint. All qualified personnel are targets. The rivalry turned human beings into strategic resources, assets to be captured, relocated, and repurposed. The Soviet program, like Paperclip, achieved enormous results. German specialists contributed to the development of the R-1 missile, the direct ancestor of the rocket that would later carry Sputnik into orbit. But while the Soviets kept their scientists in guarded compounds, the Americans integrated theirs into society. The difference was more than geographical, it was psychological. The U.S. treated the scientists as partners. The Soviets treated them as prisoners. This distinction gave the Americans a moral illusion of superiority, even as both sides relied on the same men who had built weapons for Hitler. In truth, neither camp emerged clean. The competition for Nazi expertise blurred every moral line the Allies had once sworn to defend. As the years passed, the moral weight of Paperclip deepened. Many of the scientists lived long enough to see their pasts resurface. Some were questioned during the Nuremberg follow-up trials, others by journalists in the 1960s and 1970s. Most denied direct involvement in Nazi crimes. But the documents tell another story. In one newly unsealed intelligence report, an American officer noted that a particular biochemist, later honored for his U.S. work on high-altitude medicine, had conducted experiments on concentration camp inmates. His record was marked sensitive, then buried. Another file describes how a chemical engineer accused of collaborating with the SS was declared rehabilitated after only 2 interviews, one conducted by an army major with no translation present. The moral dilemma was not lost on those within the system. A handful of internal memoranda found among the 2025 releases show that some American officials objected. One Air Force ethics officer wrote in 1950, "If we bend our own principles in pursuit of victory, we are inheriting the methods of our enemies." His warning went unheeded. The calculus of survival outweighed the discomfort of conscience. By the time America's missile program was in full swing, moral debate had been replaced by the language of progress. The ends had justified the means. The most haunting moral angle revealed in the declassified files is how ordinary the justifications became. Bureaucrats, engineers, and officers alike convinced themselves that science existed above politics, that discovery was neutral, detached from the crimes that enabled it. A 1952 Army briefing document, once classified top secret, includes the line, "Our concern is not what they were, but what they can build." It was a sentence that defined an era. The scientists' pasts were footnotes, their futures national priorities. For survivors of the camps, this quiet absolution was a second betrayal. While justice at Nuremberg punished some architects of terror, others found new lives behind American fences. Letters preserved in the archives from Holocaust survivors and advocacy groups show outrage when rumors of Paperclip first leaked to the press. "How can our liberators employ our tormentors?" one wrote in 1949. The question went unanswered then, and remains unsettling even today. What the 2025 documents expose is not a single scandal, but a pattern of rationalization. Paperclip was not an anomaly. It was a reflection of how quickly morality erodes under the pressure of fear. In America's pursuit of superiority, truth itself became classified. The system that promised transparency and justice had quietly rewritten its own ethics in the language of necessity. And yet, within those hidden pages lay the seeds of what would come next, the turning point where science and secrecy collided, and the true cost of this moral compromise would finally ignite. By 1948, Operation Paperclip had grown into an invisible empire, spanning military bases, laboratories, and secret test ranges across the American Southwest. But behind its outward success, tensions simmered in the corridors of Washington. The declassified documents from 2025 reveal a chain of memos that, together, expose the exact moment when the United States crossed the threshold from cautious recruitment to full moral surrender. Historians had long speculated about such a moment. Now, the evidence is there in black type and fading signatures, the bureaucratic handwriting of a nation at war with its conscience. The most telling piece is dated March 3, 1948, stamped confidential for internal use only. It originated from the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, addressed to the Chief of Army Ordnance, and signed by a colonel whose name had been redacted until now. The memo concerns the transfer of a select group of German scientists from temporary military custody to permanent research contracts. Among the list of names are men whose affiliations were well known within U.S. intelligence circles. Former SS members, engineers directly tied to V2 production at Mittelwerk, and physicians whose wartime experiments had been documented by Allied investigators. The crucial line, now fully visible after redaction removal, reads, "Given the current geopolitical conditions, ideological history shall not obstruct technical utilization." That single sentence marked the quiet turning point of the program. From that point forward, Paperclip was no longer an emergency measure, it was a strategic doctrine. The 2025 files include the handwritten notes of a State Department official reacting to that memo. In the margin, he wrote in pencil, "This will haunt us." His warning went unheeded. Within weeks, The scientists listed in that correspondence were granted clearance for long-term residence in the United States. Their Nazi affiliations were scrubbed from the record, their biographical data rewritten. The machinery of selective amnesia had begun to operate at full speed. Maps found alongside those memos paint an equally revealing picture. One, attached to an Army logistics report, traces the movement of paperclip scientists across the country. Thin red lines stretch from the ports of entry in New York and Boston to the deserts of New Mexico, to Fort Bliss, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. Each line represents a name, a man whose knowledge had once been used to destroy cities, now employed to protect them. The pattern of relocation was not random. It followed the trajectory of America's most ambitious technological frontier: guided missiles, supersonic flight, and atomic propulsion. The very geography of Paperclip mirrored the nation's future war map. At White Sands Proving Ground, the first V-2 rockets fired under American supervision roared to life, their trails burning across the twilight sky. Photographs preserved in the archives show German and American engineers standing side by side, arms crossed, staring at the rising fire. In their faces there is no celebration, only focus. The 2025 releases include a debrief note from an intelligence observer describing the scene. They watch the weapon rise as though watching their past ascend. It is a haunting image, the creators of the world's first ballistic missile witnessing its rebirth under a different flag. One of the most extraordinary discoveries in the declassified cache is a 1950 internal review document prepared for the Pentagon. It was meant to evaluate the effectiveness of the paperclip recruits and recommend expansion or termination. Its opening paragraph is a study in cold pragmatism. The integration of former enemy specialists has yielded technological returns that exceed initial projections by 60%. Ethical complications remain secondary to national interest. The report concludes by recommending continuation without public disclosure. In the attached appendix is a chart of projected missile ranges: V2, Redstone, Jupiter. Each line reaches farther, higher. Each new weapon erases another layer of moral hesitation. But perhaps the most striking record is a personal letter, written not by a scientist, but by an American colonel assigned to oversee Paperclip's logistics. His words, found in the newly unsealed correspondence collection, offer a glimpse into the human cost behind the policy. We know what these men were, but Washington says we must see what they can do. Every launch feels like both victory and confession. Those words capture the paradox at the heart of Paperclip. The rockets that rose from the desert floor carried not only instruments and payloads, they carried the ghosts of a war not yet buried. Each successful test was both triumph and absolution, each failure a reminder of what was being risked. Not just safety, but integrity. By 1951, Paperclip had fully merged with America's new defense ecosystem. The scientists once considered temporary technical consultants were now permanent fixtures of the national research establishment. Their names appeared on official rosters of the U.S. Army Ballistic Missile Agency. Their families had green cards, their laboratories funding, their pasts protection. The transformation was complete. What began as a covert extraction had become a sanctioned collaboration. And yet, in those very same archives, another set of memos tells the other side of the story. The doubts, the hidden investigations, and the secret moral battles fought behind closed doors by the few who still believed conscience had a place in policy. Those documents form the next arc of this story, the moment when the cost of the bargain would begin to reveal itself, written not in ink but in fire. By the early 1950s, the transformation was complete. Operation Paperclip had matured from a classified recruitment project into the backbone of America's emerging military and space ambitions. The laboratories of the desert had become the nation's new temples of progress, filled with the same men who once served the Reich, now dressed in U.S. Army uniforms and speaking English with measured precision. Yet beneath the gleaming launch towers and patriotic rhetoric lay the true consequence of the bargain. Every missile that thundered into the sky carried not only scientific achievement, but the silent weight of moral compromise. The 2025 declassified documents make this connection unmistakably clear. One file, stamped Top Secret, 1952, describes a catastrophic rocket test at White Sands Proving Ground. A V-2 derivative, assembled under the supervision of former German engineers, exploded shortly after launch, scattering debris across the desert floor. The official report blamed mechanical misalignment, but handwritten notes in the margin, now visible for the first time, tell a different story. Improvised assembly, team disputes over procedure. The team in question was a mix of American and German engineers who disagreed not about science, but about command. One officer later testified that the Germans referred to the Americans as students. It was a revealing detail. The hierarchy of wartime Germany had quietly reconstituted itself inside America's laboratories. The accident prompted internal reviews and safety reforms, but it did little to slow the momentum. By 1953, the same engineers were transferred to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. There, under the newly formed Army Ballistic Missile Agency, they began designing the Redstone missile, the first American rocket capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. The project's classified progress reports, now part of the 2025 declassification release, show meticulous German engineering signatures on nearly every technical drawing. Von Braun's name appears repeatedly. His team referred to simply as Group D. Each report reads like a confession masked as triumph. The descendants of Hitler's V-weapons becoming the foundation of American nuclear deterrence, the FI, files also reveal a startling continuity between Nazi-era design, philosophy, and Cold War strategy. An internal memo from 1954 includes the line, "Our adversaries now mirror our wartime doctrine, preemptive reach through atmospheric superiority." The irony was brutal. The very doctrines conceived in the war rooms of Peenemünde had been adopted, refined, and rebranded under a new flag. The same blueprints that once targeted London were now aimed at Moscow. Technically, they were different nations. Philosophically, the escalation was the same. The Cold War had become the Third Reich's ghost, fueled by the same minds, driven by the same obsession with reach and dominance. At the same time, public narratives were being crafted. The scientists were now portrayed as pioneers of peace, not veterans of war. Von Braun appeared in Life magazine smiling beside sleek rocket models, his past reduced to a footnote of circumstantial involvement. The declassified correspondence between military public affairs offices and major newspapers shows how carefully this image was curated. One internal note from 1955 advises editors, emphasize space research, omit prior service records. The manipulation worked. The American public came to see these men not as war survivors, but as symbols of progress. They were the face of the future, clean, confident, and redemptive. But inside the defense establishment, not everyone shared the enthusiasm. A secret review conducted in 1956 by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, now fully visible in the 2025 archive, documented rising unease among American personnel. Some officers refused to work under former SS members. Others quietly filed resignation requests. The report's conclusion was chillingly pragmatic. Integration is imperfect, but irreversible. The system had grown dependent on the very expertise it once denounced. America could not move forward without the knowledge it had imported from its defeated enemy. The cost was permanent. In 1957, the world saw the full consequence of that choice. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, shocking the United States into a frenzy. Within weeks, Congress demanded answers. How could America, armed with the very scientists who pioneered rocket technology, fall behind? The response came swiftly. Von Braun's team was transferred to NASA's jurisdiction, forming the core of the new space program. The same men who built Hitler's vengeance weapons now carried the hopes of humanity's exploration beyond Earth. To the public, it was a narrative of redemption. To history, it was a cycle of reinvention. The 2025 files include transcripts from closed congressional hearings, where a senator asked pointedly, Do we trust the men who once bombarded Europe to carry our flag to the stars? The answer, never recorded officially, was already visible in the launch schedules. Then came October 1958, and the first successful launch of a Redstone rocket carrying a live nuclear payload simulation. The photographs from that day, classified until now, show officers applauding as the missile vanished into the sky. On the back of one print, an unknown hand had written a single line. "Steel remembers what it was built for." It is a haunting reminder that technology does not forget its origins. It only changes its purpose. The roar of the Redstone was not just an echo of progress. It was the sound of a moral reckoning deferred. By the decade's end, the results of Paperclip were undeniable. America possessed the most advanced missile technology on Earth. The same expertise that once armed the Reich now secured the free world. But in the newly declassified documents lies a subtler truth, that security was purchased not only with money, but with silence. Behind every successful launch lay a file stamped altered, a record rewritten, a name cleansed. The flame that lifted rockets into the heavens burned just as brightly over the buried truths below. The rockets had risen. The world had changed. But in the afterglow of success, another story was already forming. The story of what happened when the truth began to re-emerge, and America was forced to confront the legacy it had tried to forget. When the smoke cleared and the missiles flew true, Operation Paperclip seemed, on paper, an unparalleled success. By the early 1960s, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians had been brought into the United States under the program, their families numbering close to 3,500. They had built missiles, developed jets, advanced space medicine, and given America the technological edge it needed to survive the Cold War. Yet the 2025 declassified archives make it impossible to view that success without counting its hidden cost. For every chart of achievement, there is a column of moral debt. For every statistic of progress, there is a shadow of silence. The visible gains were enormous. The Redstone missile, developed under von Braun's leadership, became the foundation for the Jupiter and Pershing programs. These weapons formed the heart of the U.S. Army's deterrent strategy throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, it was the Paperclip scientists, by then fully integrated into the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, who responded with the Juno I, launching Explorer 1, America's first satellite, in January 1958. In that moment, under the flash of cameras and the glare of headlines, the nation celebrated what it believed to be a triumph of democracy and science. Few realized that the men smiling behind the podiums had once worked under the SS insignia. The military benefits extended beyond rocketry. Aeronautical specialists from Germany advanced jet propulsion at Wright Field, while medical researchers contributed to the U.S. Air Force's studies on human endurance and high-altitude survival. Files unsealed in 2025 reveal that several of these scientists had previously overseen human experiments under the Reich's Aviation Medical Research Institute. The irony is stark. Research once used to push human limits through coercion now advanced American flight safety. Progress and past atrocity coexisted, separated only by classified folders. The American government's internal evaluations quantified the payoff in stark, unemotional language. A 1959 Defense Department summary, long sealed and now available, reported that foreign specialists had accelerated missile development timelines by 5 to 7 years and saved approximately $10 million annually in research expenditure. Another memo from the same year declared that the contribution of Paperclip personnel has justified all operational expenses. In fiscal terms, the program was a masterpiece. In human terms, it was an act of erasure. The declassified files also confirm what had long been suspected. The United States had knowingly violated its own immigration and security laws to sustain Paperclip's flow. A 1949 Immigration and Naturalization Service complaint, rediscovered in the 2025 batch, describes how at least 20 scientists were admitted under false biographical data, with the cooperation of military intelligence officers who altered records. The complaint was suppressed within a week, marked "handled internally." These bureaucratic transgressions were small on paper but vast in consequence. They institutionalized the principle that the law could be rewritten in the name of national interest. On the Soviet side, Operation Osoavi Akim had produced parallel results. Declassified comparative intelligence reports show that by 1955, Soviet missiles outpaced American prototypes in range and reliability. The competition between the two powers was, in many ways, a duel between the same intellectual lineage divided by ideology. The engineers who once dined together in Peenemünde had become adversaries in laboratories thousands of miles apart, each driven by their new masters. In Moscow's archives, as later confirmed, many Soviet officers privately joked that Hitler's scientists built the Cold War twice. The 2025 American releases echo that sentiment in a confidential Air Force briefing. Both sides inherit the same mind, shaped by the same war. The ledger of victory, however, includes its losses, and the most painful are moral and historical. Many of the paperclip scientists lived long lives, died peacefully, and were buried with honors. Very few ever faced legal consequence for their wartime activities. The Office of Special Investigations, OSI, formed in 1979 to pursue Nazi war criminals, later identified several paperclip participants whose pasts had been deliberately concealed. Some had been directly linked to the use of slave labor and unethical human experimentation. Yet by then, most were old men, protected by citizenship and time. Their files, now fully visible, include annotations such as "prosecution not recommended due to advanced age." Justice had expired before it could be served. The human cost extended beyond those who suffered in the camps. It reached into the conscience of the American system itself. The scientists became symbols of a contradiction, proof that freedom could grow from complicity, that moral lines could be blurred for survival. In universities and defense laboratories, their presence inspired generations of engineers, but their pasts were whispered about, if mentioned at all. A young NASA intern, quoted in a 1961 internal report, described von Braun as brilliant but unreachable, as if his mind lived somewhere between two wars. That distance, both psychological and historical, defined the entire generation of scientists shaped by paperclip. When the 2025 declassification made these details public, historians began rebalancing the equation. For decades, the story of paperclip had been told as one of ingenuity and necessity. Now it was seen for what it truly was, a trade between morality and supremacy, between the memory of atrocity and the pursuit of dominance. America had gained the stars, but it had borrowed the hands of its enemy to reach them. And those hands, as the records show, left fingerprints on every blueprint, every missile casing, and every launch that followed. The legacy of Operation Paperclip was written not only in scientific milestones, but in the quiet understanding that history's victories are never pure. They are built inevitably on compromise. But the story does not end with triumph or guilt alone, for as the decades passed, new eyes began to look back. Investigators, journalists, and archivists determined to uncover what the official record had long hidden. Their efforts would form the second wave of revelation, culminating in the very declassifications that opened these boxes in 2025. By the 1970s, the story of Operation Paperclip was no longer a secret, it was a rumor that refused to die. Journalists began piecing together fragments. Veterans whispered of the Germans in Huntsville, and a few investigative authors published exposés that drew both outrage and denial. Yet the full truth remained buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic silence. It would take decades and a national reckoning with transparency for those sealed boxes to finally open. The 2025 declassified archives reveal not only what was hidden, but why it was hidden for so long. The first tremors of exposure began in 1977, when the New York Times and BBC aired separate reports suggesting that former Nazi scientists had played key roles in America's space program. Public reaction was mixed. Admiration for technological triumph collided with disgust at moral compromise. Congress quietly ordered reviews, but most agencies responded with half-truths or redacted data. In 1985, historian Linda Hunt's book, Secret Agenda, pierced the silence further, using Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, requests to expose the scale of Paperclip's deception. Yet even then, entire collections of files were withheld, often under the justification of national security. The walls of secrecy had been built not only to protect intelligence, but to preserve the myth of purity, the notion that American progress was unsullied by evil. The real reckoning began at the close of the century. In 1998, amid growing calls for historical transparency, Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, compelling U.S. agencies to declassify all remaining records related to Nazi activity, war crimes, and post-war recruitment. The act led to the creation of the Interagency Working Group, IWG, which between 1999 and 2007 released more than 8 million pages of material, intelligence reports, personnel files, and internal memos that confirmed what many had long suspected. It was during this phase that the first official acknowledgement appeared. Yes, Operation Paperclip had brought Nazi scientists to America, and yes, their records had been altered to obscure affiliations. But even then, thousands of files remained sealed under exemptions protecting sources and methods. The 2025 declassification wave, born out of the National Archives' long-term review cycle, represents the final unsealing of that legacy. For the first time, archivists released the full, unredacted correspondence between the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency and the War Department, as well as clearance forms once thought destroyed. The documents confirmed the full chain of command that enabled the deception, from intelligence officers who approved falsified biographies to White House staff who deliberately avoided asking questions that might demand moral answers. These pages, yellowed but intact, carry the weight of a nation's strategic hypocrisy. Within them are moments of quiet resistance, too. A handful of internal memoranda, penned by anonymous officials, questioned the morality of the program. One dated February 1951 reads simply, "We cannot build a moral defense on immoral foundations." It was never sent. It sat in a folder for 74 years, rediscovered only in 2025. Such fragments remind us that not everyone in the system was blind to the compromise. Some simply lacked the power to stop it. The post-war narrative that once celebrated the German geniuses of Huntsville has since fractured. Historians now speak of Paperclip not as a triumph, but as a Faustian bargain, a pact in which the United States traded moral integrity for technological ascendancy. Museums and documentaries began addressing the darker origins of America's space race, and memorial institutions incorporated Paperclip's story into broader reflections on the aftermath of genocide and war. The newly released files added painful details. Photographs of forced laborers at Mittelwerk filed alongside contracts signed by their former overseers in America. Notes from engineers who wrote that, "Our new laboratories are cleaner, but the ghosts followed." The reckoning has also reshaped how intelligence agencies confront their past. The National Declassification Center, NDC's 2025 release notes, revealed deliberate intent to close a moral loop to make the record whole. Their accompanying statement read, "Transparency does not undo history, but it restores context. These files belong to the people whose history they conceal." The symbolism of that act cannot be overstated. After 8 decades, the United States formally acknowledged in its archives what it once denied in its politics: that progress and complicity had walked hand in hand. And yet, the archive's final revelation is not one of guilt alone. It is of continuity, how every generation must confront the truths its predecessors hid. The Paperclip documents are not just relics of Cold War secrecy. They are mirrors reflecting the constant tension between necessity and conscience. They show how nations justify the unjustifiable when survival is at stake, and how the language of secrecy can outlive the reasons that birthed it. By the time the last box was opened in 2025, the story had come full circle. The men who once stood beneath swastikas and later beneath stars and stripes had long since passed. Their rockets had carried men to the moon, and their designs had shaped missiles that circled the globe. But now their papers, stamped, sealed, and forgotten, had spoken. They revealed not only how the United States inherited the mind of its enemy, but how it inherited the burden of memory. And as the archivists logged the final pages, one truth settled like dust in the quiet room. The past never disappears. It waits. History is not simply the story of what happened. It is the record of what a civilization chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget. Operation Paperclip sits precisely at that intersection, where victory and compromise blur into one another. The 2025 declassified archives do not change what we already knew about rockets, wars, or nations. They change what we know about ourselves. They expose how even a democracy, built on ideals of justice and freedom, can bend its own values when survival demands it. In those faded memos and stamped approvals lies a warning. The pursuit of progress can make us blind to the cost of its pursuit. The story of Hitler's scientists in America is not one of villains redeemed, nor of heroes corrupted. It is a study in human contradiction. Men capable of genius were also capable of cruelty. A nation capable of liberation was also capable of selective forgiveness. For decades, Americans looked up at the moon and saw triumph. Few looked down at the papers that made that triumph possible. The newly opened archives finally complete the picture, not to diminish achievement, but to place it in its true moral dimension. To understand that the rockets which reached the stars were built from knowledge forged in human suffering is to see history without illusion. There is no rewriting the past, only the responsibility to face it. The archivists who turned those fragile pages in 2025 did more than reveal secrets. They reminded the world that transparency is an act of courage. Each declassified document, each restored name, is a fragment of truth returned to the record of humanity. The files cannot punish or forgive, but they can illuminate. They allow the living to choose differently, to build more honestly, to remember that every scientific triumph carries the shadow of the choices behind it. In the end, Operation Paperclip is not just a chapter in Cold War history, it is a mirror. It reflects the tension that will always haunt modern civilization. How far we are willing to go to stay safe, and how much of our conscience we are willing to trade for power. The boxes opened in 2025 did not merely unseal the past. They reopened a question that every generation must answer for itself. Because history is never only what we inherit. It is what we choose to keep. And sometimes, the most important things we keep are the ones that remind us what should never have been done at all.